Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez again. We're going to start with your graphic organizer for 23-2. So you're going to need to open up your textbook in the content library to section 23-2, page 656. And we're going to begin taking a look at this timeline. And it says, as you read about the events of the French Revolution, answer the questions on the timeline. And that's what we're going to do right now, okay? The peasants were not the only members of the French society to feel the great fear when it happened. There were nobles and officials of the church who were equally afraid. Throughout France, there were bands of angry peasants that struck out against the members of the upper class, attacking and destroying many of the manor houses. In the summer of 1789, a few months before the Women's March to Versailles, some nobles and members of the clergy in the National Assembly responded to these uprisings in an emotional late-night meeting. Throughout the night of August 4th, 1789, noblemen made great speeches. They were declaring their love of liberty and equality, motivated probably more by fear than by idealism. They joined other members of the National Assembly in sweeping away the feudal privileges of the First and Second Estates, thus making commoners equal to the nobles and the clergy. And by morning, the old regime was dead. 3 weeks later, the National Assembly adopted a statement of revolutionary ideas. So if you go to the timeline, it tells you 1789, August, National Assembly adopts the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And what it's asking here is, what are some of the rights this document guarantees French citizens? Well, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen reflect the influence, of course, of the Declaration of Independence from the United States. The document stated that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Some of these rights included liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression, and the document also guaranteed citizens equal justice, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. In keeping with these principles, revolutionary leaders adopted the expression of liberty, equality, and fraternity as their slogan. However, it didn't apply to everyone. When the writer Olympia de Gouges published a Declaration of the Rights of Women, her ideas were completely rejected. Later in 1793, she was considered an enemy of the state and executed. So in 1790, the National Assembly reforms the status of the church. So this is where they run into the problems, the state churches. I'm going to give you a few minutes to take care of question number 1. It's highlighted in yellow in your textbook. So in 1790, the National Assembly reforms the status of the church. What caused the peasants to oppose many of these reforms is the question. Well, many of the National Assembly's early reforms focused on the Catholic Church. The Assembly took over the church lands and declared that church officials and priests were to be elected and paid as state officials. Thus, the Catholic Church lost both its lands and its political independence. The reasons for the Assembly's actions were largely economic, of course. Proceeds from the sale of church lands helped to pay off France's huge debt. Remember, that's hanging over their heads all the time. The Assembly's actions alarmed millions of French peasants who were very devout Catholics. The effort to make the Catholic Church a part of the state offended them, and even though it was in accord with the Enlightenment philosophy, they believed that the Pope should rule over the church and not independent of the state. From this time on, many peasants opposed the Assembly's reforms. So the peasants became an enemy of the revolution. And this is why we're going to see many, many peasants executed. When Robespierre comes into power, the Committee for Public Safety will hunt them down and actually have them executed. I'll give you a few minutes to put in your answer for what caused the peasants to oppose many of these reforms. It's on the next page in blue, highlighted in blue. Meanwhile, as I mentioned before in the PowerPoint, Louis tries to escape, and as the National Assembly restructured the relationship between the church and the state, Louis XVI pondered his fate as a monarch. Some of the advisors warned him that he and his family were in danger. Many of the supporters of the monarchy thought France was unsafe and had already left the country. Then in June of 1791, the royal family tried to escape from France to the Netherlands. As they neared the border, however, they were apprehended and returned to Paris under guard. Louis' attempted escape increased the influence of his radical enemies in the government and pretty much sealed his fate. For 2 years, the National Assembly argued over a new constitution for France. And by 1791, the delegates had made significant changes in France's government and society. So, in 1791, on your timeline, we're on number 3 now, the National Assembly hands power to the Legislative Assembly. And the question is, what political factions made up the Legislative Assembly? And this becomes very interesting and very significant even for today. The Constitution created a constitutional monarchy. It stripped the king of his authority. It created a new legislative body called the Legislative Assembly. And this body had the power to create laws and to approve or reject the declarations of war. However, the king still had the executive power to enforce the laws. Despite the new government, old problems such as food shortages and government debt and still were a problem, obviously. The question of how to handle these problems caused the Legislative Assembly to split into 3 general groups, each of which sat in different parts of the meeting hall. This is what's interesting, because it's still like this today. The radicals, who sat on the left side of the hall, opposed the idea of monarchy and wanted sweeping changes in the way the government was run. The moderates sat in the center of the hall and wanted some changes in government, but not as many as the radicals. The conservatives sat on the right side of the hall, and they upheld the idea of a limited monarchy, and they wanted very few changes in governments. So, what political factions made up the Legislative Assembly? It's highlighted in green on the page. Moving on to page 658. Number 4. The Legislative Assembly declares war on Austria, and the Parisians invade Tuileries and imprison the royal family. So in addition to the outside, the Legislative Assembly, they wanted to influence the direction of the government too. The émigrés, the nobles, and others who had fled France hoped to undo the revolution and restore the old regime. In contrast, some Parisian workers and small shopkeepers wanted the revolution to bring even greater changes to France. They were called the sans-culottes, or those without knee breeches. Unlike the upper classes who wore fancy knee-length pants, the sans-culottes wore regular trousers. Although they did not have a role in the assembly, they soon discovered ways to exert their power on the streets of Paris. Monarchs and nobles in many European countries watched the changes taking place in France with alarm. They feared that similar revolts might break out in their own countries. In fact, some radicals were keen to spread their revolutionary ideas across Europe. As a result, some countries took action. Austria and Prussia, for example, urged the French to restore Louis to his position as absolute monarch. The Legislative Assembly responded by declaring war on Austria and Prussia in 1792. So what did the European monarchs fear from France? We're on page 658, and it's highlighted in pink. Shortly after the French troops defending Paris were sent to reinforce the French army in the field, rumors began to spread that supporters of the king held in Paris prisons planned to break out and seize control of the city. Angry and pretty fearful citizens responded by taking the law into their own hands. For several days in early September, they raided the prisons and murdered over 1,000 prisoners. Many nobles, priests, and royalist sympathizers fell victim to the angry mobs in these what was called the September massacres. Under pressure from the radicals in the streets and among its members, the Legislative Assembly set aside the Constitution of 1791. It declared the king deposed, dissolved the assembly, and called for the election of a new legislature. This new governing body, the National Convention, took office on September 21st. It quickly abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. Adult male citizens only were granted the right to vote and hold office. Despite the important part they had already played in the revolution, women were not given the vote. So, what effects did the September massacre have on the government? You're going to find it on page 658, highlighted in orange. This next part is going to be about Robespierre. And it's in 1793, January to July. The king is executed. Robespierre leads to the Committee of Public Safety and the Reign of Terror on your timeline. In the early months of 1793, there was one Jacobin leader called Maximilien Robespierre. He slowly was gaining power. Robespierre and his supporters set out to build a republic of virtue by wiping out every trace of France's past, which means wiping out all aristocracy, all nobility, anyone who is adherent to the Catholic Church. So he had quite a few people that he was bent on wiping out. Firm believers in reason, they changed the calendar, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days and renaming each month. This calendar had no Sundays because the radicals considered religion an old-fashioned and dangerous. They even closed all the churches in Paris and the cities and towns all over France. In July of 1793, Robespierre became the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. For the next year, he governed France virtually as a dictator, and the period of his rule became known as the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety's chief task was to protect the revolution from its enemies. Under Robespierre's leadership, the committee often had these enemies tried in the morning and guillotined in the afternoon. Robespierre justified his use of terror by suggesting that it enabled French citizens to remain true to the ideals of the revolution. He also clearly saw the connection between virtue and terror. So, what was the stated aim of Robespierre and his supporters? Highlighted on page 659 in purple. I'm sorry, that's page 660 in purple. And finally, Robespierre is executed. The Reign of Terror ends. It's on your timeline for 1794 of July. And then in 1795, the National Convention adopts a new constitution. So the question here is, what were some of the consequences of the Reign of Terror? Well, for one thing, the French opinion shifted dramatically. After Robespierre was put to death, the National Convention turned on Robespierre. They demanded that he be arrested and executed. And that pretty much ends the Reign of Terror. People of all the classes, had grown really weary of the terror. They were tired of the skyrocketing prices for bread and salt and the other necessities in life. And in 1795, the moderate leaders in the National Convention drafted a new plan of government. This is the third one since 1789. And it placed power firmly in the hands of the upper middle class, and called for a two-house legislature and an executive body of 5 men known as the Directory. These 5 men were moderates, not revolutionary idealists, and some of them were corrupt, and they made themselves rich at the country's expense. Even so, they gave their troubled country a period of order. They also found the right general to command France's army, Napoleon Bonaparte. So, on page 661, highlighted in green, is the answer to number 7. What were some of the consequences of the Reign of Terror? And that ends the graphic organizer for today. Thank you.